Good evening and welcome to the February 26th Council Work Session. Before we start our first agenda item, we have a moment for items of interest and committee reports. Does anyone want to be in the queue for that?
I know Betty did.
Betty has one.
She has her hand up right back there.
And before Betty gets to her seat, I have one, so I'll just jump in while she's getting here, which is that I brought party favors for you all. I know that you don't have enough paper, but the Shelter and Supported Housing Subcommittee of the Poverty and Homelessness Board has been meeting and reviewing their strategic plan, and so they actually provided these incredible charts. So I'm going to pass them around. And they are graded green, yellow, and red for where they are on various projects. Very informative. So when people ask you, what's the work of the Poverty and Homelessness Board, you now have a reference point, and have also told us in today's meeting that the Committee on the Permanent Shelter will come forward with a contractor who will do the feasibility study for the permanent shelter, and that we should hear about that in the next week or so. So that there's movement on that, and they'll also provide us with a timeline for how that work will proceed and what we can expect. So that's my report. Betty, did you
have a color code? A legend with all these colors?
Green
green,
is in
yellow, red means.
yeah.
What are blue, pink, and green?
Oh, I think they're just to distinguish the categories. So I think
Oh, I see.
it's just to help you see when you're moving into new category. Yeah.
Pool numbers.
Yeah. Okay, Betty.
Thank you. I wanted to know what happened to the inclusionary zoning. It was on the future for work session, and it's no longer there.
I don't know. We'll have to get back to you. I don't know what it's at.
Well, I hope somebody can find it.
Oh, part of the CET discussion in April.
Those two things have been combined.
They've been
Been combined with something.
One work session, with the CET work session.
It was a work session. It would be good to have it listed. I thought it
Right.
was listed, and now it's disappeared.
So we should.
And what I've been hearing from constituents, well, still turkeys, also speeding in school zones. I wonder if anyone is paying attention to that. I'm personally familiar with two of the places where people never slow down in school zones, one on Coburg Road and one on 30th Avenue. But a lot of people are saying, why don't you arrest people or ticket people who speed by schools? And I think that could take some attention. What else do I have working problems? And one more thing, I wonder why we're always getting the Thursday packet on Friday. It's hard enough to do it if you get it on Thursday, and Friday makes it, it's been happening a lot lately. And that's all. Thank you.
Anybody? Yep. Go for it, Emily.
I've been noticing that downtown is getting fuller with people on the sidewalk, and earlier than in other years. I'm really concerned that we get started earlier than we had planned on our downtown activities, because we need to do that. I want to reiterate from the goal-setting session that climate recovery ordinance is one of our top goals, even though it wasn't a tier one. That was just for the goal-setting session. So, people who didn't hear that at the session, I'm repeating it for you, that yes, we need to really, really work on this, especially to involve things that people can do besides recycling and riding our bikes. I think we really need to get together on that. I learned that our tree plan is 27 years old, so I'm going to pursue getting that newer. And still hearing about fast people on Jefferson, and could we have some speed bumps? And that's it.
Okay. Anybody else have an item? Yeah, Craig.
Two things real quick. HSC meeting today, nothing of note. Coming out of that particular conversation or discussion, we actually ended early. And the second thing is that we have Mayor Karen Freeman Wilson from Gary, Indiana, who's the first vice president for National League of Cities, is coming to Eugene on Thursday and will be speaking at LCC at 6 p.m. In the Center for Meeting and Learning. And their talk is going to be on education, not incarceration. And before she became mayor, she was the Attorney General for Indiana and was a leader in the drug court movement when she was a municipal court judge. So if any of you would like to come out to that, that's going to be happening Thursday at 6.
Thursday. Oh, I thought that was, okay. Got it. Thank you. All right, anybody else? Right. Oh, Alan.
I just had a quick update on MPC. And one of the things that we talked about was the federal infrastructure package. And it flip-flops the way that the federal government dealt with us in a lot of ways. In particular, it used to be that the feds provided 80% of the funding and we provided a match of 20%. This flips that on its head, and they provide 20% and we provide 80%. So there's this push by the administration to have more of the costs go away from the federal government onto local government. So I think we should probably get used to that model in terms of what our share is going to be. Federal government is going to be smaller and smaller. And for the first time in years, there's actually talk of an increase in the federal gas tax, which hasn't, I think it's 18 years that hasn't been raised. And as well, part of that infrastructure package was the privatization of our infrastructure and transportation towards third parties and toll roads, which work in big metro areas, but not so good in rural areas, I suspect. On the legislative issues for Oregon, a couple of things. One is there's a bunch of clarifications that need to occur for the transportation bill that passed, and including DMV fees, some more work that needs to be done on autonomous vehicles. Multnomah County is wanting to increase their registration fees in their county alone for bridges, and I thought that was an interesting way to go about it. And I think that's and then finally there's some information that we got from the state safety performance targets, which are a requirement of the state for us to adhere to, and it has several different metrics that are statewide data, and then they'll get down to the MPO data, and we asked to get our local data, things like the fatalities on your transportation system, the fatality rate per 100 for vehicle miles traveled, and the injury rate per vehicle miles traveled, plus the nominal number of how many people are injured. And that data should be able to help us with our Vision Zero, which is coming back to us pretty soon. So the thought was that they would be able to get us that data in time for it to be incorporated into our Vision Zero stuff that's coming back to us in a couple of weeks. I'm not exactly sure when that's coming up. It's on the agenda.
Great. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. I think we are ready for the first topic of the work session. Manager?
Thank you, Mayor, and I'll turn over to Mark Schoening, City Engineer, for his conversation around quiet zones.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor Bennis and City Councilors. This past May, the Council was presented with the recommendations of our Railroad Quiet Zone Citizen Panel for the safety measures needed at the 10 rail crossings from 8th and Hilliard to Van Buren needed to establish a quiet zone and a recommended funding strategy to implement those measures. The City Council at that time approved the recommended safety measures with the addition of pedestrian gates at Pearl Street, but not take any action on the funding strategy that included funding the 3 East End crossings with Riverfront Urban Renewal District funds and the 7 West End crossings with a general obligation bond. At the end of last year, you had a presentation on the status of the downtown riverfront development, and included that was the discussion of again, the proposal to fund the 3 East End crossings with Urban Rural District funds. And several councilors expressed concern with moving forward with the East End funding and implementation without having a firm source of funding for the 7 West End crossings. So in addition to the concept of a general obligation bond for the West End crossings, there's 2 other funding sources, viable funding sources for that work. One is the road fund, and the other is the general fund marginal beginning working capital. So this past legislative session, there was a substantial increase in gas tax and registration fees that fund the state highway fund, and cities and counties get a percentage of those revenues. And for the city of Eugene, our share would be approximately $1 million in the current fiscal year, $2 million in fiscal year 19, and then almost $3.5 million in fiscal years 20 and 21. And then that amount will continue to increase until it's the increases in the state gas tax and registration fees is fully implemented in fiscal year 27. And that'll be an ongoing source of revenue to the road fund. And so this new revenue to the road fund may be used to fund the safety improvements at those 7 West End crossings. What it wouldn't be eligible to fund would be the additional fencing identified by the citizen panel. So the fencing isn't essential to establish a quiet zone, but as was pointed out by our citizen panel, trained engineers in a quiet zone don't blow their horns routinely, but if there's someone trespassing, that's an instance where they would sound their horns. So if the fencing isn't part of it, then there's still the risk of continued trespass and continued train noise, even with the safety measures in place. So the new revenue to the road fund could also fund other unmet needs in the road fund, including that last increment to fully fund our pavement preservation program to eliminate the backlog on all of our streets, or implementation of the Vision Zero Action Plan, or the implementation of the measures in the Transportation System Plan to meet the Climate Recovery Ordinance. The general fund marginal beginning working capital in this current fiscal year was $5 million, and that varies from year to year. And in the past, it's been used for strategic investments such as cleaning up homeless camps, facility capital improvements, some of the downtown operations programs, and human services. But it could be used to fund the 7 West End crossings, and it could be used to fund the additional fencing. But the amount isn't known until the audit is complete, so that happens sometime in late fall, and that money is typically budgeted in the first supplemental budget of the fiscal year. And there's also many unmet needs within the general fund that would also benefit from those funds. So the recommendation before you is to implement the quiet zone safety measures at all 10 crossings, and later this evening you'll have action before you to consider funding the East End with urban renewal funds at those 3 crossings. So action on that, but also action on expanding the urban renewal district boundary to include the Pearl and High Street crossings. And then to fund the safety improvements at the 7 West End crossings and the additional fencing from a combination of road fund and marginal beginning working capital out of the general fund. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions on that.
Okay, thank you very much. I have Betty in the queue. Anybody else with a? Okay, Betty, start it off.
Before Mike.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for telling us some of the other things that money could be used for. I was going to mention that we have many needs. And if we're going to spend millions of dollars on something, I think the public should be allowed to vote on it. There are some of the things that we need more road repairs than we've been really lucky, successful at getting road bonds passed, but they don't take care of everything, all the needs for roads. So that's a big need. We need park upkeep. We're going to ask people to vote for that. We need to get rid of the rats. We're going to be talking about that soon, but maybe the city could pay for rat extermination instead of expecting homeowners to. We need to open the walls on Kesey Square, and that's something that we could use city money for. There are many, many needs, I'm saying, and I don't think that the public would necessarily say that a quiet zone is number one. A lot of people want a quiet zone, but they don't talk about millions of dollars to get it. And I think it's important that if we're spending on a project, if we're spending millions of dollars, people should be able to vote on it and say whether that's the way they want their money spent. And I'm really concerned about that, about our just deciding that we will spend all that money on this one thing without knowing what the public really wants and whether they want to pay for it in that way. Thank you.
Okay, Claire?
Thank you. Well, thank you for these options. I just want to point out that we've had many people. There's a petition, online petition that was gathered that I think had about 300 signatures of people, plus comments, asking us to implement a quiet zone, and this council has agreed to do so. Our question now is, how do we pay for it? In this proposal, to use the additional revenue from the road fund, not the road bond, would we be shorting the pavement preservation project from what had been thought it would have in terms of funding?
No, because this is a new revenue source. But overall, there's approximately between the two bond measures, the local gas tax and the reimbursement component of transportation SDCs, we're at about $12 million annually, and to fully eliminate the backlog of reconstructs would be about $17 million annually.
Right.
So there's about a $5 million gap to fully implement that program.
So
again, this is new revenue
it's new revenue,
hasn't
right?
been allocated.
So right now, it's not taking money away from anything else,
Right.
and it's one-time money, right?
Funding the quiet zone would be one-time money. The gas tax revenue is ongoing.
Is ongoing. So we have an ongoing revenue source. We'd be spending it on one time to implement a quiet zone, and then we wouldn't need that extra revenue for that any longer, and it could be put into pavement preservation, for example. So in terms of how soon this estimated $3.6 million might be gathered from the gas tax, this combination of the gas tax, and if we go with your recommendation, the marginal beginning working capital, would it just be 1 year's worth of additional revenue that we'd be taking from the gas tax?
Well, it could be in 1 year. It could be over multiple years, because I said when we had the work session on the quiet zone, working with the railroad is really a 3-year process in terms of their design work, their purchasing of equipment, and then their construction. So it wouldn't all have to happen in 1 year. It could be over multiple years.
And then you've noted for the Vision Zero and the transportation system plan implementation, which are both very also high priorities of this council. We don't know right now what the cost of implementation is for those items, so we haven't figured that out. I hope my fellow counselors will support this recommendation, and I might take a second round.
Okay, great. Emily.
Thank you. I'm pretty much going to reiterate what Betty said. 100%, I think we should have quiet zones. There's been a huge outcry for them, and the health and sanity benefits would be really big. But we've also heard about gentrification, but still, I think we need the quiet zones. But the funding is really, really bothering me. We have so many projects that are really feeling essential to many people. And the quiet zones are really only downtown and in Whitaker, but the whole city would be paying for it, and other crossing zones wouldn't be taken care of. So I'm also concerned about the CRO, and we could use the road fund money to put in more protected bike lanes and fix the sidewalks, which are pretty dangerous. And then the general fund money, I don't want to use it for this personally, but I wonder what other people think, because, we've got the shelter, we could improve parks, maybe get part of a pool. We have the emergency shelters like car camping and stuff. We could help that downtown. We need more public safety, and general fund can go towards that. So I'm certainly not against the quiet zones. I would like to have them, but I'm wondering how people would rank them according to other desires we have. So I'm really hesitant to go ahead and say, okay, people think this is the most important thing for us to do right now with this available money. And also just the recommendation that we pay for it with two methods, the road fund and the general fund. I'd like to know what projects, how much, which fund are they coming from, because it's just kind of nebulous right now how that would work. So I don't know that I'm not going to go forward with this, even though I want the quiet zones, because I just think there's too much demand for our money. And I know there's been a lot of public outreach, but I'm just wondering if now the majority of people would say this is what they want. So maybe we should have a vote. Thank you.
Okay, Jennifer.
Thank you. I think Emily makes a good point about priorities. We may want to open up Kesey Square, but when you're getting woken up every night multiple times, I think that crosses over into a need. I want to make sure I'm reading this chart right. Is this a buildup, like we get 1 million and then the next year we get 2 million and that's combined, or is that an additional 2 million?
That's an additional. So this year was 1 million because it's the first year of or it's actually just a half a year. So the new revenue went into effect the first of the year. So we're only seeing a half year of the revenue. So the first full year is the 2 million, and then it ramps up in the next state biennium to.
Okay, so by the end of 2019, there would be 3 million altogether if it was
right.
Okay, so is the strategy? Okay, yeah. Okay, so would the strategy be to use some of this and some of this other general fund and kind of save it up a little until we get to 3.6 million, or take all of the money from the first source, and then if we still need a little extra, then take it out of the general fund? I'm wondering, is there a plan there?
Yeah, I don't think there's a solid plan yet, other than the fencing isn't eligible for a road fund, so that definitely would be a general fund item. And then the timing of it is such that we wouldn't need, as I mentioned earlier, wouldn't need all the funding in the first year because of the time it takes to work with the railroad. So that could happen over several fiscal years.
Right, because so by 2020 we have, I'm not a great person at math, but like way more than we need, right? So some of that could be redirected into other areas. Yeah, I'm very much supportive of this, and I think the combination of using different sources so we're not all taking everything out of one pot was a good idea.
Okay, Alan.
Yeah, I reiterate that we've heard from many, many people on this, and we've been working on this. How long have we been working on this, Mark? Before any of us had gray hair, almost years,
Probably
actually.
Well, at least as early as 2008.
Oh, only. Okay, a decade. And the benefits actually accrue to the entire city, not just the immediate vicinity. And Whitey Lewick, who's been one of the people working on this in my ward, he lives in South Eugene and like around 28th Avenue. So it's people hear this all over the city. Do you know on average how many average daily horn blasts there are? It's like,
I don't know. There's I think approximately 23 trains between Amtrak and Union Pacific that
times
go
10
through those.
stopping times 3 blasts each.
Right.
So thousands, almost 1,000. High hundreds.
524 every morning.
Oh, what? And maybe you could go over the costs, if I understand this correctly. For the 7 outside the urban rural district, you can go over that too now, because that would make sense.
Okay.
So the 7 that are outside the urban rural district, the bulk of this money, $3.6 million, would come from the new money that comes out of the new transportation package, which was money that we didn't have before, and only $350,000 of it would come out of the general fund.
That would be one way to do it, right? Yeah, I mean, there isn't a specific proposal before you. It's just between, the idea is that the city manager, in his budget, would come up with that funding strategy.
Yeah, okay. I'd like to nail that down a little bit more. I too would like to minimize our general fund exposure on this project because there are many competing constraints that we've already mentioned: the Vision Zero, transportation system plan, implementation plan, climate recovery ordinance, a whole bunch of things, homelessness and housing and all these things that we're talking about are general fund stuff. So minimizing road things from the general fund make a lot of sense to me. So is that your plan, to minimize the
Yeah, so I think
portion?
So part of it is, as Mark mentioned, there are some costs that cannot be paid for by the gas tax.
The fencing.
I do think Vision Zero is an example of things that could be paid for with the gas tax. Some of the CRO transportation components can also be paid for the gas tax. And we don't know, as you know, how much will be in marginal beginning working capital until an audit is completed at the end of every fiscal year. And then every year we bring a recommendation back to the council. If you were to pass this recommendation, what we would do is take into account all the various priorities at the time, see how much marginal beginning working capital is actually available, and then our intent would be is to have a portion of that apportioned to this project as opposed to paying for all of it out of the gas tax, because the gas tax actually, there's competition for those dollars too, just as you mentioned, Vision Zero, CRO, and things like that. So we don't know specifically how much that is because we don't know what the marginal beginning capital will be on any given year. But our intent would be is to at least share some of the cost between the two sources for the total cost of the project.
Yeah, my interest would be in minimizing the general fund portion of that. Is that in line with your
Well,
interest
I think we
as
just
well?
want to see what the majority of the council would say. If you'd like to minimize that, of course, we definitely could minimize that as we bring back our recommendations at the margin beginning working capital. And then anytime we bring that back, if there's too much allocated or recommended to be allocated, you can reduce that, and that can shift over to the road fund at that time as well.
Right, 'cause this will come back at the budget. So maybe
Yes.
the maker of the motion could, on the suggested motion, from a combination of road fund and general fund beginning marginal working capital, and maybe add in there that minimize the amount from the general fund.
Duly noted.
Mike, you're up, so you can
Try
respond to
figure
that.
out. Or Catherine can.
Manager, excuse me, Mark, thank you very much for all the information. You've started to touch on the thing I was going to say in response to a couple of my colleagues' concerns about the proportions here, that unless I misread the recommended motion, all of this is coming back in specifics with the budget, and so we'll have an opportunity to redebate how much from this and how much from that. All this instruction is doing is saying, hey, go figure out the details and bring it back to us with a budget, right?
Right. You're not appropriating any dollars with this action. You're giving direction that would say, yes, it could be two different sources in which you're going to bring back as part of budget motions as opposed to a single source, for example.
We'll still have the ability then to debate and say that we like those proportions, we'd like to alter them at budget.
Yes, you're not making any of those kinds of decisions tonight.
Okay. So I'm comfortable with the way this is written. I'll just say, because I know that at some future point here within the next few months, we'll be able to debate as a council the appropriate percentage there. I would suggest that it would be very helpful to be as specific as you can with regard to beginning working capital, that you know at the time. That obviously you won't know all the details in April and May, but you'll have a better idea by then. Okay. Would you? I'm sorry. I was going to ask if you want me to read it.
Claire?
Yeah, thanks. Well, so I appreciate the conversation, and just a quick reminder, the council had put the quiet zone on a list of capital projects in 2008, but had to drop the idea of building it when the recession hit. So it's been an important issue for the council and the community for a long time. And I really feel like if it was that important to have the voters endorse the funding of the project, we should have included it in the road bond, but we didn't. So in order to achieve this project that the council has approved, we need to make some choices, or else it's going to be another 10 years or longer before we get a quiet zone. I did want to speak to, I had forwarded an email from the Whitaker Community Council to my council colleagues and the mayor expressing their neighborhood council's opposition to moving forward with the quiet zone unless this council had also made a commitment to addressing the economic pressures that is affecting Whitaker and other affordable neighborhoods. The Whitaker Community Council has given voice to a concern that many people who can live there now will not be able to continue to afford if the pressure increases to increase rents as new development increases and property values in that area increases. I think this is a very important topic, and right after this work session, we will be taking up as a council the topic of housing affordability, and I feel comfortable speaking for my colleagues to say that the council recognizes the urgency of the issue of rising rents and housing costs, and will start the work of looking at policies to try and address some of these challenges in the coming months. I have also heard from other Whitaker residents in the past few days who are very eager for us to implement a quiet zone, and I think they will be pleased if this motion should pass that we've given direction to the city manager to build funding into the next budget. And then I think we should expect to hear from folks outside of the 10 crossings further north of the city who will be asking us to implement phase 2 of a quiet zone once we've accomplished phase 1. Thank you.
Thank you. Betty?
Thank you. Will you repeat again, what's the total amount of money we're talking about for these 7 crossings? How many million?
It was almost 4 million. It was 3.6 million
Okay.
plus the 350,000. So
Almost 4 million. And I just want to repeat that if we're spending that much money on a project, I think the public has a right to vote on it. One thing we could do, which I didn't mention before, we've set aside 1 million for a shelter. We could take a couple more million and maybe get close to building a shelter. And if the public wants it, if people vote for it, it's okay with me. But I do think when you have a huge expenditure for a project, that the public should have a right to vote on it. They may think there's some other need, some other huge need that's more important than this. Thank you.
Can I just clarify, and of course the council can choose whatever their funding they would like, but the road funds that Mark is talking about for much of this wouldn't actually be eligible to be put towards a shelter or some of these other projects.
The general fund, however, could.
Right.
And the road fund could be used to take care of that huge backlog we have on road repairs.
That's correct.
Right. Thank you.
Alan?
Yeah, I was just going to reiterate that this money's just not available for all sorts of things. It has to be used basically curb to curb, and it can only be used for roads. That's why I was suggesting that only the very smallest portion, the fencing portion, which we can't fund out of the road fund, be used out of the general fund. So to me, minimizing the general fund is an important aspect of this whole thing, and using the very restrictive monies that we get from the transportation package and the gas tax to do things like this is in keeping with what I think we should be using that money for. We couldn't use it for a shelter. We couldn't use it for homelessness. We couldn't use it for any of the other things that we're talking about, but there are certain other things we can do with that money. But it has to be related to roads.
Okay, are we ready for a motion?
Yes, ma'am. I move to direct the city manager to include funding for the safety improvements for the 7 West End rail crossings and the additional fencing in the FY19 budget from a combination of road fund and general fund marginal beginning working capital.
Second, because it's my job.
Alan?
I'd like to amend to add and minimize the use of the general fund.
Do we need a second for that? Will someone second that amendment?
I'll second that.
All right. So we vote first on that amendment. Any other discussion about that? Okay, all in favor of the amendment to the motion? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, 8. We've got it. Okay, and now for the main motion, all in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Opposed? 2. Okay, that passes also. Thank you very much. And thank you for a very clear explanation. We appreciate it and happy to move forward. Okay.
Whenever you're ready, Terry.
Ah,
The copies are coming around of the presentation.
oh, great.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Terry Harding. I'm the Principal Planner for Long Range Planning for the City of Eugene. Been with the city about 12 years, working mostly on urban growth boundary related projects and Envision Eugene and neighborhood planning. And I have with me today Stephanie.
Good evening. My name is Stephanie Jennings, and I am also in planning and development, and I manage the city's affordable housing programs. I've also been with the city about 12 years, and Terry and I have worked together extensively over time, but this is the first time we've ever had a chance to co-present to City Council. But this issue really does cross both of our issue areas, so it feels very appropriate for us to do so.
I agree. So what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about understanding housing affordability and then quickly get into how missing middle housing, what that is, and how it might be able to help. We'll provide a suggested framework for looking at ways the city can affect this issue. And so we've broken that into 3 categories: plans and policies, land use code and process, and programs and incentives. And then we'll talk with you about next steps.
So we wanted to start off with a graphic that many of you have seen already, but really I think does a good job of illustrating some of the housing affordability challenges we have in our community. It's meant to provide a high level of analysis of who lives in our community and really what can they afford when you look at their incomes and look at when you take 30% of that income and say you can use this for your housing costs. And we have a lot of people who live in our community who either have limited incomes or fixed incomes, and so that includes seniors, persons with disabilities, students, people who are starting out in life and maybe have a lower wage temporarily. We have a middle group of folks that have incomes between $35,000 and about just under $75,000, and then we have a group of folks that have household incomes above $75,000. When you take that next step and try to match up those incomes and buying household budgets with what kinds of units we have in the market, it's clear that we have a really significant deficit at the lowest end. And part of this is that those incomes really can't cover the cost of building affordable housing. And so there's not enough incentive there to really meet that demand. We also see a deficit in the middle area, which I think of as people who are first-time homebuyers, and so we have a number of people who are looking for places to live affordably in that middle income range that are also having difficulty at this point in time. When we talk about housing affordability, it gets complicated really quickly, and there are a very large number of factors that affect housing affordability. I think we all have commented on increasing rents, housing prices, low vacancy rates. We think about income and employment, rising incomes. That's a very positive thing. But it also, new jobs, higher wages also result in more competition and demand for affordable housing. I think everyone is familiar with the phenomenon of older children living at home. And once those children get jobs and move out, they're forming a new household, and that household is out there competing for housing with everybody else. On the other side of the equation is the cost of development. And so we spend a lot of time talking about land supply and price, land use regulations and process, permit fees and charges. There's also other factors that are largely outside of the control of local government. So talk about the cost of construction, including both materials and labor, availability and financing, trends in real estate investment. These are all also factors that can have very significant impacts on the cost and availability of housing in our community.
Thank you, Stephanie. So with that kind of broad overview of what we mean by affordability, we'd like to talk with you about this thing called missing middle housing. So first of all, I'd like to clarify right up front that when we use the term missing middle, we're talking about a form of housing. It's a term coined by an architect talking about everything between a single-family home, standard-sized single-family home, and larger apartment buildings. And types of housing in between those largely went away after World War II. In some cases, we put in zoning barriers. In other cases, there were financing barriers to having them being built. But we do have historic examples, and we'll see some in these next couple of slides, and new examples. So first, at the lowest kind of scale is secondary dwelling units. These are smaller homes on the same lot as a larger primary home. Then we have small lot detached houses, which are just smaller houses on their own lot. And then cottage clusters. And these are cottage scale house form, but can be grouped around common open space or common parking. And then we have a little bit higher density forms, starting with the plexes, still a house type form, but in these buildings you have either 2, 3, or 4, a duplex, triplex, or fourplex, sharing one structure and gaining efficiencies that way. The courtyard housing type are several buildings attached to one another around a common courtyard. And then the row house type are narrow lots with skinny houses or townhouses connected to one another. And they often have access from an alley or behind the homes. Here in Eugene, we have examples of these. The SDU up there in the upper left is a newer structure. The duplex is a historic building in the downtown. And then the bottom picture is a mix of clustered types at an affordable housing development, Turtle Creek. So that one is newer. The courtyard example here is near Oakway Center, I believe. The row houses are the much beloved Peterson row houses at 16th and Olive. And then the Plex is also in the downtown. So the point here is that these types tend to have a house form. They can range from small to medium in scale. And the reason I think there's a lot of interest in them in terms of helping with our affordability is that they offer a variety of different ways to save on costs. Number one, they share walls. They are typically smaller, so there's less space to heat and cool. They require less maintenance over the life of the structure, and possibly a lower barrier to entry for home buyers when compared to a standard-sized single-family dwelling. They can also provide affordable rents, potentially, and savings gained from being located in areas that are already served in our community with public services such as roads and parks and schools. But those benefits are not necessarily intrinsic to them being missing middle housing types, especially when it's new construction.
I would just add that these, in the development of affordable housing, these missing middle forms are widely used because they're more affordable than single-family homes and they fit in well in different neighborhoods. That said, it's still necessary to layer several additional subsidies on top of doing this form to actually make it affordable. And so in and of itself, it's not sufficient to make something affordable, especially for the income ranges we're trying to meet with our current affordable housing programs. So with that, we're going to transition to the ways in which the city can influence housing issues. And so the first area are plans and policies. And there are really two significant plans that are adopted by council that address housing issues. The first is the Eugene Springfield Consolidated Plan, which is a plan that we do every 5 years. It's a federal requirement document, but it includes an extensive analysis of housing affordability, housing quality, overcrowding, population-specific needs, and this needs assessment, once that is completed, you use it to develop an affordable housing strategy and a community development strategy, and we report on that progress every year through what's called the Action Plan and Consolidated Annual Performance Report.
Second plan is our adopted land use plan, Envision Eugene, which you're all familiar with. We have in place our urban growth boundary now. We also have a pillar. One of the 7 pillars of Envision Eugene is to provide housing affordability for all community members, and that's similar to the language in statewide planning goal 10. We need to have enough land and also regulations that result in there being enough housing for everyone in the community. So to implement Envision Eugene, we have a few projects underway that touch directly on housing affordability. We'll be preparing a housing chapter of our own comprehensive plan that will work with Stephanie's team to integrate the goals of that plan with the consolidated plan. We have launched a neighborhood planning process in River Road and Santa Clara. And this is an exciting opportunity because there is local funding and grant funding set aside to study housing issues, in particular in the River Road neighborhood. And what we learn from that study, we'll be able to apply potential solutions within the plan. That is a good opportunity. We've also launched urban reserves planning, where we're looking forward up to 50 years of future land needs for housing and other types of uses. And we know that that land needs to meet our affordability needs as well as all of our other needs. And lastly, the growth monitoring program. So this is an effort that will measure how we're growing compared to how we assumed we were going to grow in our urban growth boundary work, and that's underway as well. So that was plans and policies. The second area the city has a lot of influence over is land use code and regulations. And we've called out a couple of current efforts here that you've directed us to begin work on. The first is updating our clear and objective standards for housing. And that is work that's recently started. In addition, you've provided direction on how to update our secondary dwelling standards and comply with Senate Bill 1051. And then this language, remove barriers to small attached and clustered housing types, is both in the consolidated plan that's already adopted and in the Envision Eugene recommendation from 2012. So it's been existing direction that, again, we have numerous areas of work where we can further this goal and bring new knowledge about what the barriers are now in today's housing market and offer solutions to those, particularly in River Road. This is just an example that we've already started thinking about what some of those barriers might be. And I won't go through this, but suffice it to say there's a number of limitations on most of the missing middle types in our R1 zone. We haven't completed an exhaustive audit, but we are interested in doing that.
The third area where the city can influence housing in our community is incentives and programs. We have a range of incentives that are already in place for the development of affordable housing and a couple of additional ones. And there's been a lot of discussion recently about additional potential incentives and programs, particularly as the council and community consider a potential dedicated, flexible local source of funding through the construction excise tax. And this is another item that's coming up on the council agenda on April 9th. And so there's, regardless of perspectives on the specifics of the CET, I think the conversation that has come out of this reflection is identifying a variety of different potential opportunities for creating incentives for homeownership, for missing middle forms, so there's a lot of, I think, very good ideas that are being generated at this point in time that we're following and paying attention to.
So Stephanie touched on incentive programs for different levels of income. We can also look at incentives as being something that we can use to help encourage certain types of forms of housing. And so we can expand and create new programs to incentivize SDUs or missing middle types or development along corridors. Location and form are things that relate to our urban environment and how we are getting the kind of development that we want. And so assistance development charge incentives are on your agenda for Wednesday. We're proposing a compact development and SDU incentive, so take a look at that. And lastly, another program and the type of assistance we provide is through our design handbooks and consultations. And an example of that is we did produce a missing middle handbook. This is on our website, includes a lot of graphics and photos to explain the concept. And there's a handy walking tour that includes all of the types within a 3-block area. Okay. When we were considering how to provide a framework for taking action in the 3 areas that we've talked about, we did a little research and found some other communities that are doing different things. These are a couple of them. From more of a limited approach on the Beaverton side to Seattle strategy, which is super intensive, multi-year, very deep dive into the issue. Locally, we have a group of people coming together. The Better Housing Together Forum last Wednesday packed the Urban Memorial Union, and these issues are also being studied by our Housing Policy Board. So it's really a very ripe conversation that has a lot of angles and excitement in the community right now. And as we continue addressing the issue within efforts that are currently underway, what I think we're really looking forward to is your conversation about what outcomes we want to focus on. And that will really help us come back with ways to get to those outcomes that you're most interested in seeing.
Anything else? Any comments or questions?
Thank you very, very much. I have Alan, Mike, and then Greg in the queue.
Yeah, thanks for this really good information. This is my work session poll back in July 2017, by the way. The crisis, of course, is that over 40% of Eugenians spend more than 30% of their income on housing. That's called housing burden crisis. And what I wanted to do with this work session is get info about that. And the Better Housing Together Forum was great. 235 people were at that event after work, and 40 people were turned away because it was full. Do we have that infographic that we got at that? This one for the council?
Extra copies for you.
Oh, yes. There you go. Maybe we can pass those out to council that didn't get that. If you weren't at the meeting, they handed this out. It's a very informative piece of information. And I wanted to have a work session about why do we have this crisis, what types of housing are we talking about that we need, that we didn't build, that we need to, that are affordable, and finally, what can the city do about it? And when I think about the 3 phases of problem solving, there's assess, learn, and act, and we're in the assess phase, and then we need to learn what we can do and talk about that, and then figure out what the plan is. So I kind of see this as a 3-phase work session. And I'm very interested in seeing what barriers we can break down. We've already had that started that conversation. What regulatory issues and streamlining we can do to lower costs, to incentivize builders to do this, like inclusionary zoning or code, zone changes, parking permits, streamlining of the process, timing, parking requirements. Other incentives like SDC waivers, the CET, community bank to help fund some of these projects. I think this is all a very good start. The items that you listed in this are stuff, and the stuff that we're already doing is a very good start. And I'm eager to work and help figure out how we can incentivize people to build this type of more affordable housing that is called missing middle housing. I always want to call it missile-mitting housing, but missing middle housing and affordable housing.
Okay, Mike?
Easy for you to say.
Yeah.
I agree with Alan that the assessment phase is probably where we are before we take a lot of action on things. There are a lot of questions that I'd like to know the answers to. One of the things is You spoke about 2/3 of the way through there about the growth monitoring out of the 7 pillars there. So I want to dive down a little deeper on that. When the acting police chief was here with us the other day, he was talking about population increases of near 1% when the Guard comes in the last couple of years. When the Guard comes out and talks about the PSU stuff, when they release it, it was closer to 2%. When I go online and look at the PSU population growth forecast, and then versus what did we actually do in the last 2 years, I got us at 1.88% growth 2 years ago and something closer to 1.9 last year. So I would really like to have PSU-based actual numbers on how much did our population grow compared to what we planned. We planned for 34,000, which is a lot closer to 1%, as I understand it, over the course of the 15 to 35 planning window. I want to know how much we're off every year from that number. Considering they didn't take into account with their metrics some of the things that I kind of wish they had. Because I think that gives us a flavor each year. Hey, guys, we planned for this, but we're getting twice as many people, for example, as we planned on. So that's going to put pressure on one of the factors that you listed, obviously. When were these numbers created from this slide, this fourth slide here?
They were created last year.
Last year. Okay.
Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah. And I will just add that some of that information is from the census, which is a 5-year rolling sample. So it's not always the most current.
You mentioned large windows of time when you're doing the federal reporting stuff. So I just wondered if this were how old was this stuff?
Correct. No, we did our last consolidated plan in 2015, and this data is newer than that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. I would like to see, for example, comprehensive costs in renting versus owning cost of a home. I know that our housing market is higher than most any, and I'd love to see an actual comparison to cities sized similarly to ours across the western United States as maybe a base example. My understanding is that typically cities are 60% owned and 40% rent. University cities are obviously going to be a little different, but we're a little bit better than 50% rent and less than that in own. I'm going to run out of time in 13 seconds, so if I have a second round, I can go through all the other stuff too.
Got it.
But I would like to see that regularly to know. I think that's a goal that came out in our goal setting this weekend, that we want to address that, housing ownership.
Okay, Greg?
Hey, thanks, Mayor, and thanks for the report. Couple of things. Councilor Zelinka rattled off a whole bunch of program possibilities and incentives in his comments. One of the things that I want to get to is this, and I want to get back to something that Mike just alluded to with population, is, we can create new programs, we can develop new incentives, but how are we going to pay for them? Where is the money going to come from? What are the revenue sources to address those particular incentives or programs? And the other thing is that we have a serious divestment at the federal level from affordable housing, and it's been going on for years. And so because there are no or very few incentives left for developers to build affordable housing or even build middle housing, how are we going to realistically create the programmatic means for them to be able to want to invest in creating that housing? And then back to the population deal. Oregon is the largest in-migration state in the country right now. I think we all know that. You go anywhere in Oregon and stuff is being built like crazy. I was in Bend last summer and the construction was out of this world. There's still construction going on in Eugene too. It's just not where a lot of people can see it. It's out on the outskirts. It's out where I live in Bethel. It's out in Santa Clara. It's out in other places. But it's not keeping pace with what the demand is. And so I think we really need to get a better handle on what our population growth is really going to look like. And the demand, because let's face the fact, and I don't mean to be derogatory toward any of our neighbors around us, but when people come into this area, they want a Eugene address. They want a Eugene, Oregon address. And so, therefore, this is the place where people are going to want to live. Those people who want to get into new homes, to homes that are a little less new, and those folks that are just trying to get a basic place to live, an apartment, a room, or whatever the case may be. Eugene is the place that they want to be. So we have to figure out how we can create the kind of supply that we currently don't have.
Hey, Chris.
Thank you. Great presentation, a lot to think about. And I think I want to kind of come at this from a higher aspirational level. And for me, a lot of this housing conversation really boils down to, if you want affordable housing, you have to figure out ways to encourage more building and or encourage builders to build, give them encouragement, and then take away the barriers, the things that discourage building. And it's that balance between how can you encourage and how can you take away discourage that I think becomes this whole issue for us. And so everybody looks at the things we're doing in terms of, well, does this really encourage building, or is this actually discouraging building, or some balance in between? And the conversations we have in many cases are a combination of both encourage and discourage. You can look at a tool, and in some ways that tool encourages building affordable housing, but it also discourages at the same time. So you're having to figure out what's the proper balance for that tool. For example, when you had the slide that talked about land supply and price, we were finally able to land our Envision Eugene process because, at least for me, it incorporated an urban reserve discussion. For me, that's critical. I could not have landed an Envision Eugene conversation without having that valve in place to be able to talk about how are we going to accommodate growth, whether it's this many or that many. You got to be able to accommodate growth. And so the urban reserve conversation, particularly one that is inclusive and thorough, is going to be critical to any sort of continuing conversation about encouraging and not allowing the discouragement. The land use regulations and process, permit fees and charges, I think there's a lot of opportunities there to look for ways to help builders save money. Permitting fees, the process they have to go through. There's a lot of opportunities in there for us to be able to move from a discouraging building to an encouraging building. We have to examine all of those to look for ways we can make that much more efficient and effective. Cost of construction, availability of financing, as you mentioned, those are not necessarily things that the city is directly involved in, but they are huge opportunities for us to be partners with others who can provide that kind of stuff. We can be partners with people who provide materials and labors. We can be partners with folks who work on financing to figure out ways to encourage and incentivize additional financing opportunities. Because, yeah, without money, you can't build. Without money, you can't buy. So we need to figure out ways to encourage, once again, what that might be. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, which often doesn't get picked up, is, I think, a very strong motion that underlies a lot of this conversation, and that is the fear, the worry that when you do build, it's going to be ugly. And I think we need to have a theme, a watchword that says no ugly development. Whatever it is we do, it's going to be aesthetically pleasing. I don't want ugly in my backyard, but I might be willing to look at something that is attractive. And so no ugly development.
Claire.
There's a motto. Well, thank you. Thank you for this presentation, and thanks for getting us started on this conversation. I'm glad to see us knocking down some of the department silos that we've had in the city between our planning department and our staff who's dedicated to our affordable housing work. So I agree with what Alan said, that we're in this listening, learning phase before we get to an action phase, and it's important that we do that wisely. But I also believe we need to do this urgently and not take too long with our learning phase before we start taking steps to address this issue, because it just like the train, it's coming down the tracks, and we're not going to be able to stop it. That we need to be in a position to have some effect and some ability to guide and steer things. So, my hope is that, if we pass a motion, that I would like to see staff bring us back as many ideas as you think are possible or viable or you've seen in other communities. I would like to have a large menu of options, from incentives to code changes to partnerships with organizations like NEDCO, which I know we've had in the past, easing up of the process to required to build, whatever it is that covers the breadth of the issue. One additional suggestion I made at our council retreat was that we need some FTE that's dedicated to this issue, which we don't really have right now, just like we have for our economic development department. And I might even add some language, if folks are amenable to the motion, which reads, the city manager recommends council direct staff to return with ideas for potential actions to further housing affordability in Eugene. I would like even a little more specificity, with an emphasis on actions that will help preserve existing moderately priced housing stock and expand opportunities to create more such housing stock for both renters and homeowners.
Affordable housing stock. You say affordable housing stock?
Good.
I said moderately priced.
Okay. I have three folks asking for a second round. Mike, then Alan, then Greg.
I understand the outcome you're searching for with that language. I have some real challenges with the definitions around some of that and how we actually get into staff action. I think I hear what you're saying, and I agree with you about the outcomes, but we may be a little bit soon for that. This was one of the big three in goal setting for council that we wanted to do a much deeper dive on, and I hope this isn't just, you bring us back some stuff in a couple of work sessions or council meetings in the next half of a year. I hope we get into this and have a work session once a month on more details here if necessary for us to make more informed decisions than we have. When we had this conversation before about the affordability of housing as opposed to affordable housing, and I really would like to see us be able to use definitions that, when I think affordable housing that the council's trying to get built, I think subsidized housing, as opposed to what can we do to see that the market is producing enough housing that's affordable for the people who live here to buy and or rent. So the language issue is a part of this. One of the things I was mentioning just right there at the end of my first round was the idea that the growth information matters, I think, because as I mentioned, I looked at this more deeply for 16 numbers. Eugene grew 1.88%, Springfield grew 1.9 something, Veneta grew 2.5, Junction City grew 4.5%. Now, I can't tell you what the relative increase in home values were in that year relatively in each of those areas, or the increase, but I'm relatively certain it was an increase in rents in each of those areas, and the percentage that is rental versus ownership in each of those areas. I want to see a regional dynamic so that, because I know working in this industry as a mortgage person, that the decisions that we make drive actions in those communities too. We're the big dog in the yard here in this, in that our city is larger. And so a lot of the decisions we make about policy drive what happens in those other communities just by virtue of people making regular market decisions about one place being less expensive than another. So I really hope we can look at our effects on the region, because I think it can help us make smarter decisions to get at what Greg was saying, was that, yeah, I wish everybody that wanted to could live in Eugene, but if they want a particular housing type, then they often move somewhere else in order to get it. So I hope we see all of those comparatives. Then I may need round 3 here. The other piece, there goes the time.
Right.
I need round 3.
I'll get you back here. All right, Alan.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been struggling with is I keep hearing builders and architects say one of the problems here, and I heard it again at the Better Housing Together forum, was the lack of land supply is part of the problem. And at the same time, I hear the planners say we have 20-year land supply within our UGB and we met our requirements and we didn't need to expand the UGB to do that. And that seemed like they were in conflict in my head for a long time until I was talking to Terry, and I think I kind of maybe figured it out, which was they're not the same thing. They actually both can be true at the same time, because the 20-year land supply is about meeting the need, having enough supply to meet the need that we're projecting, and the builders and architects are talking about a sufficient amount of supply, high enough sufficient amount of supply to keep the price low so that we can build and do affordable housing. Those two things can be true at the same time, so they're not necessarily in conflict. But we didn't blow out our UGB to add to any housing stock. And maybe you guys can talk to that for a second.
Sure. Well, as a couple of you have touched on, the UGB work did in fact land in 2017, but it took a while, and it was based on data back to 2012. And so I'll just say a part of that was recognizing that it does take a while to get through the work necessary to establish an urban growth boundary, but we have already started updating that data, and we'll really look forward to bringing you back how we're doing versus what we assumed. So both urban reserves and growth monitoring have kicked off. We're hoping to update you on our progress later this spring. But I agree with something Alan just said. It's not that we're saying, oh, we have a 20-year supply of unconstrained land.
Don't worry about it.
We're not saying that. In fact, we're very worried that we don't have enough, and we want to get those updated numbers so that we can start taking a multi-pronged approach to solving this issue. The numbers are out of date, and we need to get caught up.
Yeah, and something that Chris said, we do want to encourage missing middle housing, and that can come from a combo. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to have a bunch of new programs that cost money. It can be a combo of lowering costs through regulation and time and waivers, and then also potentially increasing revenue through the construction excise tax to get to new programs towards affordable housing. So it can be a combo, and there's a bunch of trade-offs in there that we need to fully discuss in the learn and assess phase. Like Shane Johnson from Hayden Homes, the regional manager, he mentioned that for every $1,000 that we increase the cost of a home, 250 people drop out of home ownership market capability. And so that's a trade-off that we have to be, I don't know if that's absolutely correct or not, but it's probably pretty close. So we need to have that trade-off in our head, talk about the net difference probably is a good way to think about it. And while I rattled off a whole bunch of stuff, I don't have the answer yet. I'm interested in what everybody has to hear, but I am interested in supporting what Claire said about gentrification. I think it's a very important issue, very hard issue. We were talking about it on Saturday, how do you deal with gentrification and improving neighborhoods so that then the landlords feel like they can increase the rents, and then where do the people that can't afford to live there go? And that's a pretty important issue for us to tackle in this discussion. So I support what Claire was adding to this motion.
Okay, Greg.
Good, Al. You just teed me up on something I had thought about. One of the things that I have questions about when we talk about incentives and programs, so take, for instance, we forgive SDC charges to incentivize and help a development in a particular case. What are the actual costs behind doing that? What are we trading off? Okay? Because when we decide to forgive SDC charges or to waive them, then we have less in the SDC pot in order to invest in park infrastructure and other infrastructure and amenities that these are designed to be for. So that intuitively, for me, says that devalues some of the neighborhoods or communities that we're trying to build up if we're not having a full, robust investment, in our SDC program. Same thing goes with, and I'm going to say the bad word, MUPTI. When you have a 10-year tax exemption, what is the real trade-off in that in terms of revenue to the city and what we invest in, developing, housing programs that are necessary. So what I would like to see is kind of a spreadsheet, if you will, or a chart that really kind of gives us what are the upside and downsides of how we do these incentive programs and these development programs, and what we are losing and what we are trading off by giving up this for that. That's one thing. The second thing is redevelopment, and nobody ever wants to talk to me about redevelopment. People I've talked to in the housing industry said, we just can't do that around here, and I don't see why not. We have a lot of properties that have fallen in disrepair. We have a lot of empty lots around this community, and and we have them in R1 zones and R2 zones, and to me, I'm looking at an empty lot on Taney Street, and I'm like, okay, how come we're not building housing here? And a distressed property that used to, have housing on it or some other use on it, and we're not redeveloping that property. So I want to really kind of see how redevelopment plays into this conversation, and if we can do something to incentivize redevelopment of these kinds of properties.
Claire.
Thank you. Well, great conversation. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate Councilor Clark talking about definitions, because I was struggling with that as well. How do we refer to folks in our community who are housing burden, who are at the lower end of the income scale? These are sensitive topics, and we want to be clear about what we're trying to do and what our goals are. So if staff has any recommendations, because we have referred to subsidized housing as affordable housing in this community for umpteen years, so changing that language is challenging. So I think it's important for us to acknowledge that and make an effort to figure out what makes sense. And I also am glad that I was not able to go to the Better Housing Together forum, so I'm glad you clarified what the term missing middle housing is actually referring to, because that is not what I thought. And understanding that it represents many types of housing options that we are currently lacking. So we're not giving people choices, I think, is one other theme in there. So not only are people unable to afford housing they may need or desire, other people are living in housing that doesn't meet their needs because they don't have the variety of housing options to choose from that would serve our community better. So I think that's an important piece kind of underlying some of this as well.
Thank you. Mike wants a third, but I want to just take a moment to jump in and just say a couple of things, which is to resonate with your comment that this is urgent and we want to act on it. And at the Better Housing Together forum, that really was the final part of that forum, which is what are you going to do about this? That was a very action-oriented forum, and there were 235 people. So I think the goal is that we have staff with expertise, we have council with political will, and we have the public, working on this, and we are looking to get that work done. The other very interesting piece about that was really a very clear statement about public-private partnerships, that this is, we have to think about doing this differently in some fundamental way. So it's taking an opportunity for staff, and I think the folks at Better Housing Together will also come up with a list and coming up with a sort of a big brainstorming list about what's outside the box. And then how do we keep bringing all of those people to the table? So I think that other question is the structure of this conversation and how we make sure that those folks who aren't normally at the table are at the table in this conversation, so that as we move forward with more and more definition about what we're doing, people have, we're all on the same page for that. So thank you, and I'll give Mike one last
Thank you,
round.
Mayor. I was just going to say that this is a difficult conversation to have because of all the pieces that are involved in it, and there are an awful lot. And it's one of those, whack-a-mole type deals where one little move of the lever here makes another dog over here, and one person's redevelopment is another person's gentrification. And so the sensitivity to all those things, while it's good to do those, we have to understand the different views on all those pieces. Now, I was real happy to hear you say a couple of things in that last round. Number one, at the Better Housing thing there, I heard what Shane said as well, and I consider him a good friend. We work together pretty frequently, and I know that I don't want to speak for him, but I know he's mentioned out loud his concern with the CET is exactly along the lines of what you were talking about when we increase costs, and it's exactly what I was talking about the other day when I said for us to add that along with the increase in SDCs or doubling of transportation SDCs, not discounting them, but that's what we've done this year, and the increase in parks SDCs and the adding of the bond and the levy and the adding of what will likely be the school districts. If you look at those real dollars on an average home, we've added $10,000 of cost to a new unit just this year. So I want us to have a real I agree with you. I'd like us to have a real conversation about our effect on cost comparatively to our neighbors, because I think that drives a lot of people's decisions about where they're going to live. I know Springfield discounted their SDCs while ours are going up on a fairly large scale. So I'd like us to be able to have a conversation about where we are where we are reasonably within the scope of the complete market of places people have to choose from. Another thing is that we got an email. I was happy to read here the clear and objective standards, obviously, is a piece that we've talked about. But in an email the other day, it mentioned first report back to council by the end of a year. My understanding of both the motion here and at the county commission was that we would be done with clear and objective standards within a 1-year window. Can I have that clarified for me?
Yeah, we'll have to get back to you. I don't recall the exact language, so we'll send something back to you.
That one's going to be important. I'd really, really like to know the answer to that. Thank you.
Emily and then Betty.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. You mentioned that the missing middle houses would have less maintenance. Why is that?
Potentially less maintenance costs due to their smaller size and typically a smaller yard as well.
Sure. Yeah. I would also add, the fewer external walls you have in a unit, the less maintenance costs. And so single-family homes, you've got 4 walls and a roof that is exposed to the weather. When you have apartments, you see a lot less maintenance costs because they have far less exposure.
That makes sense. Mm-hmm. Thank you. I agree that aesthetics are really important. I know you can't legislate everything, but I think aesthetics are important for our mental health, and that we don't need to use expensive materials to make beautiful buildings. I'm really interested, as Greg is, about the trade-offs for less SDCs, permitting fees, waivers. Where is that money coming from? What are we giving up to give those incentives? And, you know, are we going to make the CET make that up? Because that's going to raise the cost of housing too. So, yeah, I'd like to encourage housing, but this, again, I have a lot of things that need to be funded. So I'm cautious. I'd really ask us to end our violent crusade against innocent moles.
Guess what?
Innocent moles.
All right. Oh.
I'm not killing you.
I didn't say rats. I said moles. You can whack a rat.
Okay. I just wanted to mention two types of housing that I don't think you discussed: boarding houses and single-room occupancy. Are two things that used to be available lots of places, and they're put types of housing that people who couldn't afford anything else could afford sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, are we ready for motion?
Yes, ma'am. Forgive me, I got a screen right here. I move to direct staff to return with ideas for potential actions to further housing affordability, and, well, I'll let that stand and make my own.
Second.
Okay. Claire and then Harry.
Okay. So I'd like to amend the motion to include language which would go at the end of the motion that would read, with an emphasis on actions that will help preserve existing moderately priced housing stock and expand opportunities to create more such housing stock for both renters and homeowners.
Second.
Okay, so Mike, you want to speak to that?
Again, I like that goal. That says we're not going to redevelop anything, or we're going to limit our redevelopment if we're going to preserve. My point was I want to have more of a conversation about what our terms mean, what our data is before we start this, and I think we need at least one more. So I'm gonna vote no unless we alter it a little bit more generally about what the work is. I think we still need to do, just because I agree with both of you, and they seem kind of diametrically opposed to me, and I don't want to give staff the wrong idea about what it is we're expecting them to run off and do.
I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
Claire, do you want to
Speak
speak
to it
to
on
it?
my turn?
Yeah.
I can wait my turn.
I think you're the only, Alan. I'll let Alan and then you. Okay.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, I don't see them as mutually exclusive. Maybe if you use the words including instead of with an emphasis on, that would make that more palatable. And it's not intended to be, this is the only thing we're going to look at. It's intended to bring up the issue of gentrification, which I think is an important, tough issue to deal with that often gets kind of shifted aside in these kind of conversations because they're difficult and and the solutions aren't readily apparent. So maybe you could alter that language. But I don't see them as mutually exclusive at all.
Chris, do you want to speak to this?
Yeah, just quickly, I don't see them as being in contradiction at all, because a lot of the projects that Housing Policy Board does are funding the redevelopment of existing buildings in order to preserve them, to keep them in place and keep rents down. So in the Whitaker in particular, you'll buy a building, you'll do a rehab on the building so the building is preserved, but in an improved redeveloped state. So actually there are ways where the two actually work together, and part of the goal would be you preserve the building so you keep the rent low, even as you improve the building so someone doesn't have to live in a hovel just to get low rent.
Mm-hmm. Right. Betty, were you
I just wanted to say I'd like to vote on the amendment as it was.
Okay, so do we need to, can we hear, Claire, do you want to speak to it again?
Yeah, well, I don't, it's not meant to be exclusive of other strategies. So by saying with an emphasis on, in my mind, it's elevating those particular goals in the whole conversation, but it's not precluding specific strategies that might get at other goals that we have within this conversation, because these aren't the only ones. But I do think it sends an important message about our intentions as a council and what is on our minds as we're working on this. So we want to give everyone, I think, more housing options, no matter what their income level. They should should be able to have a relatively decent opportunity to find the type of housing they want, and we don't have that yet. And that's addressing people at the upper income level as too. So it's, I think I'm going to keep my proposed amendment the way it is and see if it passes.
Okay, so are we ready to vote on the amended language? All in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, there you go. Okay, excellent. So now we're back to the main motion. Everybody ready to vote on that? All in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All right, that passes too. Thank you very much, and we are adjourned until 7:30.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.